Page 109. Black. On my way to school the next morning, I got a newspaper. There was a story about Eddie and me being charged with the stick-ups and shootings. The headlines over it read, "High school athletes charged with dropping the ball." The story told all about how Sidney Parker, a bus driver on the route that ran past my house, had recognized me. It said that he was the father of 3 children and hoped to be back at work in another month. The article kept on about what Parker said. "I've never been afraid of young people. I've always been afraid for them, but I'm angry as hell too. I'm angry these kids think it's all right to do anything to get what they want. I guess some of them deserve to be locked up like animals." Then Parker told how he had nailed me. I just couldn't look at that gun pointing at me, so I turned my head and was facing the other kid. Then I remembered where I saw him before. I read his words over and over until I knew them by heart. I tossed the paper away at a block before school. When I stepped through the front door, Jefferson and Connolly had one open on their desk. I could see the headline upside down in front of me. Connolly buried his face in it and started reading the article out loud. Jefferson said good morning to me, talking right over his partner's voice. Eddie didn't come to school that morning. His mother and Rose weren't there either. In English, Miss Sussman blew a fuse after some kids passed a newspaper around in the middle of class. When she was done screaming, her eyes started to water up. She went out into the hallway for a few seconds and pulled herself back together fast. At lunch, Moses and Exus never stopped talking about my case. They said that Eddie getting charged was the best thing that could happen to me. "Now you got somebody to take half the heat, and that somebody is white," X said. "I'll bet Eddie's father's a Mason like most of the judges," Moses said. "He'll probably throw up some secret hand sign that only other Masons know. Then the judge will go easy on him. That's got to rub off on you, too." That sounded crazy to me, but I didn't want to argue over any of it. X brought up the idea that Eddie might be at the DA's office working out a deal for himself, one that wouldn't cut me any slack at all, but I couldn't buy it. I wouldn't believe Eddie would ever play me dirty, but not even with the DA breathing down his neck, and maybe even with his parents. After school, I didn't want to go home for anything. I knew that someone would have shown my mother the paper and she'd be steaming. There was never practice the day after a game. The playoffs were starting next Friday, and Casey would push us hard that whole week, but I wanted to feel a basketball in my hand, so I headed upstairs to the gym. The place was empty except for Casey and some other gym teachers working in their office. I took the last practice ball from the rack, the one that nobody else ever wanted to use. It was probably 10 years old, and the leather grips had worn down to nothing, but it always felt perfect when I spread my fingers around it. I passed it underneath the glass case on the wall that holds Jason's white home jersey. He wore number 15, and nobody else is ever allowed to have that number again. I bowed my head out of respect. Then I stepped onto the court. I raised up both feet with the ball high over my head. At the top of my arc, I let the ball roll off my fingertips. My right wrist fell loose into a perfect gooseneck, and the ball slipped through the net. I made that same shot over and over, and the deeper I got into a good groove, the more I was sure that Eddie would never stab me in the back. I had been shooting for maybe 20 minutes when Casey came out. He started feeding me passes, and I buried a half a dozen shots. Then he walked the ball out where I was standing. "This thing got a lot of attention today," he said. "Coaches are probably going to walk away from the idea of giving you a scholarship. You might have to play at a skitty college for a while until you can prove yourself again." He didn't even mention the idea of me sitting in a prison cell for the next few years, and I was glad enough to hear it. Casey said he had already called my mother, that she had seen the article and was spitting fire over it. He told me that he'd called Eddie's house too, but he only got the answering machine there. My mother had calmed down by the time I got home, but she was all business that night. She talked to my lawyer, Miss Torres, who told her I didn't have many choices, that by the end of the week a grand jury was going to indict me for sure, that in a trial there was no way she could make Sidney Parker look like a liar, so unless I wanted to take a big hit, I was going to have to cop a plea. Then the state would go easy on me for saving the money by skipping a trial. She told my mother I should work on getting letters from my teachers saying I was a good student. I knew we could count on Coach and Miss Sussman for that. A Daily News was sitting closed on the kitchen table the whole time my mother was talking. Eddie's name didn't come up once. Then she caught me looking down at the paper. "What kind of deal is your best friend working out for himself?" she said in a sharp voice. "Or didn't he talk to you about it yet?" "Look, you don't know what Eddie's doing," I answered. "Neither do you," she said with a hand out in front of her to slow herself down. "Neither do you, Marcus." "I know we both screwed up," I told her. "And you're right, he's my best friend." "And you're my son," she came back at me. "Who else is going to look after you? The Russos?" Those words were like the last good shot in a street fight. I didn't open up my mouth again, and neither did my mother. Only she didn't have anything left to prove. Eddie was back in school the next day. At practice, the rest of the team didn't even mention the story. Casey wouldn't touch it either, and stuck to basketball. When practice was over, kids gave up so much space in the locker room that we wound up walking out together. After the first block, we hit a red light and the traffic was too much to cross against. "So I guess a grand jury is going to indict us," I said. "My lawyer says the DA could indict a ham sandwich if he wanted to. That's why we don't even have to be there to open our mouths," he answered back, moving out into the street. Eddie timed the cars just right and ran over to the other side. I was caught footed and just watched him sail across. When I finally reached him, Eddie said, "Besides, the woman who picked out my picture isn't even 100% sure." He told me that the coach of St. John's called his house and left a message. The coach wanted to know what was going on and for Eddie and his parents to get back to him. Eddie's father had his lawyer call back instead, saying that Eddie was innocent and would be there in September. Eddie kept his eyes straight ahead the whole time he was talking. I watched the side of his face pull tight when he called us a team. He said the DA couldn't prove a thing, not the way he needed it to in court, and the cops were just fishing for one of us to get scared. I never said a word back to him about it. The only time he turned to look at me was when we were split to go home. He made a fist and put it out in front of him to connect with mine. "When we win the city championship, they'll have to write a bigger story about black and white," he said. I had to finish an essay for Miss Sussman's class that night. Everybody had the same topic. How do you want people to remember you? I wrote that people should remember I was a good person, that I watched out for my family and friends and never bothered anybody, and that I tried my best at everything I ever did. It looked all right on paper, but I kept thinking about the stick-up. So I started another essay. I wrote about being remembered for doing more good things than bad, and that I was lucky to have friends and family who cared about me. I put my name at the top of it and chucked the first one into the garbage. I wasn't going to lunch because I didn't know what to say to Eddie's mother, but the next day I passed her in the hall. We were on opposite sides of the white lines that run down the middle of the floor. There were lots of kids between us, so all we had to do was turn our heads and keep walking. Casey had us working on our fast break at practice. We'd move the hall all the way up the court without taking a single dribble. A kid standing under the basket would pretend to snap down a rebound, slapping the ball between his hands. He'd turn and hit a second kid running at a half court with a pass. In one motion, that player would zip the ball to the third kid streaking up ahead of him, and he'd lay it in. When it all worked out, you could hear the ball pop off kids' hands 1, 2, 3. You'd close your eyes and know if they did it right by the sound. Coach hadn't made a Friday speech since I got arrested, but before we went in to get changed, he called us over to the bleachers. "I know it's been a rough couple of weeks for us as a team," Casey said, "but we're all going to get through this season together. Everybody's going to learn something from it, including me. I just want you to remember, we didn't get to be a team because we're all wearing the same color uniform. We did it by working together, and by sticking up for each other. So in the locker room, on the court, and in school, stay focused on supporting each other. That's what being a team's all about." It was a good speech, and some of us even started talking it up right before we got back inside to change. Too bad that it had to be about Eddie and me and not about winning the playoffs. Eddie was the first to finish getting dressed. He leaned over to me and said he had to meet his father somewhere. He dropped a hand on my back and he bounced. Miss Torres called that night to tell me I had been indicted. She said if I agreed to cop a plea, she could get me home inside of 2 years, and if I would give up the shooter, she could do even better for me. I told her to take the plea. My mother stared me down and started drumming her fingers on the kitchen table.